Good evening, and welcome back to our quiet corner of Edwardian England, where the lamp is low and a place is kept for you by the window. Tonight, we go down to a riverside town in Devon, in the warm blue and gold of late August 1906, on the week of the summer Regatta. The estuary is bright with boats and bunting. A brass band plays far across the water, and at its edge lies the tea garden of Georgina Prowse, a serene woman of 52 who has kept it alone since her husband passed. Each morning, at first light, Georgina finds a single white water lily laid in the little boat her husband once rowed her in. Who leaves it, she cannot say. She knows only that the river holds more than it tells, and carries her gently through the week. So rest your head and dim your light. If you find comfort in these quiet tales, do stay and subscribe, and let us keep this corner glowing for you. And tell us softly, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let us begin. On the first morning of Regatta week, Georgina Prowse came down through her tea garden in the early light, as she came down every morning to make the day ready before the world awoke. It was very early, earlier than the town, earlier than the boats, earlier even than the gulls that would presently be crying over the quay. The hour Georgina loved best of all, the still soft hour before the day put on its bustle, when the tea garden was hers alone. She came out of the little cottage behind it, with the dew still grey on the grass, and she stood a moment at the top of the sloping lawn and looked down at the whole of it, her tea garden, going down in gentle terraces to the water's edge. The white-painted iron tables and the wicker chairs set out under the old willows and the one great chestnut, the striped awnings furled for the night, the rose-covered veranda where the finer teas were served, and beyond the low garden wall, the broad shining estuary, pale gold and perfectly still in the haze of the early light, with the wooded hills soft and blue across the water. She had made this garden. She and Hubert had made it 20 years and more ago, out of a rough sloping paddock by the water that nobody wanted, and they had drained it and levelled it and planted it and set out the tables and built the little veranda and trained the roses over it, and opened it one summer to the boating people and the day trippers and the town. And it had prospered quietly, gently, in the way of a small good thing well done. It was the loveliest tea garden on the whole estuary, everyone said so, and Georgina thought so too, though she would never have said it aloud, and she loved it in the deep, wordless way you love a thing you have made with your own hands and your own long years, and could no more have given it up than she could have given up her own right arm. And this was its great week, Regatta week, the one week of the whole year when the quiet estuary town woke fully to life, and the river filled with boats, and the bunting went up, and the brass band came, and the day trippers poured off the trains, and the whole county, it seemed, came down to the water to watch the races and take the air and drink their tea. And the tea garden, all that week, was thronged from morning to night, table after table, tray after tray, from the first pot of the day to the last, the busiest and brightest and most demanding week in all its year. It had been Hubert's favourite week. Georgina stood at the top of the lawn in the early light and let herself think it gently, the way she let herself think of Hubert now, 3 summers on, without the sharp edge that used to come. Regatta week had been Hubert's joy. He had loved the boats, loved the races, loved the bunting and the band and the bustle and the crowds. He had been a great one for the water, had rowed in the regatta himself as a young man, had known every boat and boatman on the estuary. And all through the long, thronged days of the week, he had been everywhere at once, carrying trays, cracking jokes, hailing the boats, in his shirt sleeves and his old straw boater, as happy as a man could be. And then, at the very end of each long day, when the last customer had gone, and the band had packed away, and the light was going long and gold across the water, he had done the thing that Georgina remembered now above all the rest. He had untied their own little boat from the landing stage and handed her down into it and rowed her out onto the still evening water, the 2 of them alone at last, to rest and to watch the light go down over the estuary, and to be quiet together after the long, glad noise of the day. That had been the best of it. Not the busy day, though the busy day was good, but the still evening after, the 2 of them out on the darkening water in the little boat, Hubert at the oars, herself in the stern, with her hand trailing in the cool river, saying little, needing to say little, watching the swifts go screaming high overhead, and the first lamps come out along the quay, and the last gold die off the water. 20 summers of it, every regatta week of their life together, had ended so, out on the still water in the little boat, and it had been, taking one evening with another, about as happy as Georgina had ever known how to be. And then 3 summers passed. In the winter, after a regatta, Hubert had died. Not on the water. That would have been too much. Quietly in his bed of his heart, in the grey of a February morning, with the estuary flat and cold outside the window, and the boats all laid up for the winter. He had not been ill above a week. He had simply worn out, the doctor said, like a good old boat that has done its work. And he had gone, gently, holding her hand, and left her the tea garden and the cottage and the little boat and 20 summers of the water. And a silence she had thought, that first winter, she would never learn to live inside. But she had learned. That was the thing about grief that nobody told you, Georgina thought, standing at the top of her lawn in the early light, that you did learn to live inside it, that it did not stay sharp, that it softened in time into something you could carry. She had learned. She had kept the tea garden open against all advice, for everyone had told her a woman alone could never manage it, least of all through regatta week, and she had managed it, and managed it well, and got through 3 regatta weeks now on her own 2 feet, serving her tea, soothing her customers, keeping the loveliest tea garden on the estuary as lovely as it had ever been. But regatta week was hard. That was the truth she did not say to anyone, the truth she hardly said to herself, that the week which had once been her happiness had become, since Hubert died, the week she quietly dreaded. For it was the week most full of him. Every tray she carried, she remembered him carrying. Every boat on the water she half expected to see him hail. And every evening, when the last customer had gone, and the light went long and gold across the estuary. She felt the shape of the thing that was missing, the untying of the little boat, the row out onto the still water, the quiet together at the end of the day. Felt it like a room gone dark, like a hand let go. She had not rowed the little boat in 3 summers. It sat at the landing stage where Hubert had left it, tied up, unused, gently going grey with weather, and she could not bring herself to untie it, to row out alone onto the still evening water, where they had always gone together, was a thing she could not do. It would have been too much, too empty, too full of him. And so the little boat sat unused at the landing, summer after summer, and Georgina got through her regatta evenings with her back to the water, packing away, not looking at the boat, not untying it, not rowing out, and told herself that this was how it was now, and would always be, and that she was content enough. Which was true, mostly, except in the long gold light of the regatta evenings, when it was not quite true at all. She shook the thought off, gently, in the way she had learned, and came down the sloping lawn to begin her day. There was a great deal to do before the town woke, and the first customers came. The tables to wipe of dew, the awnings to unfurl, the china to bring out, the urns to fill and light, the roses to be dead-headed on the veranda, the whole bright machine of the tea garden to be set going for its busiest week. Bethany Quorn would come at 8 to help her wait the tables, and young Perry Dowell would come to fetch and carry, and the day would fill and roar and pass. But this first still hour was hers, to make all ready, and she loved it, and she went about it now in the pale gold light, with the calm, unhurried competence of a woman doing beloved work she knew by heart. She came, in her round of the garden, down to the low wall at the water's edge, and to the little wooden landing stage that ran out from it over the shallows. And she went out along it, as she did every morning, to see that the tide had done no mischief in the night, and that the landing was sound. And it was there, at the end of the landing stage, in the little boat, that she saw the water lily. She stopped. There was a water lily lying in the little boat, in Hubert's boat, in the little unused rowing boat that had sat tied at the landing these 3 summers. There, in the inch of rainwater and river water that always lay in its bottom boards, floated a single white water lily, one perfect bloom, its broad petals open to the pale morning, its heart a soft, deep gold, fresh cut and dewy and lovely, lying in the bottom of the boat exactly where the passengers' feet would rest, exactly below where she used to sit. Georgina stood at the end of the landing stage in the still gold light and looked at it, and her heart did something complicated in her breast. It was a real water lily. There was no mistaking it, no trick of the light. A real, fresh, perfect white water lily, floating in the bottom of the boat, cut that morning. The dew still on it, the cut stem trailing. And it had not drifted there. That was the first thing she understood, looking at it. Water lilies did not grow at the tea garden landing. The water there was tidal and brackish and swift, no place for lilies. Lilies grew upriver in the still fresh water, in one place above all that Georgina knew, a quiet backwater 1/2 a mile up, a secret green lily pool off the main channel, sheltered and still, where the white lilies grew thick every summer. Hubert's Pool, she had always called it in her heart, for it was there, above all places, that Hubert had loved to row her on the very stillest evenings, up the quiet river to the lily pool, to sit among the lilies in the last of the light. Nobody else went there. It was hard to find and harder to reach. Up a narrow, overhung channel, most people rowed straight past. It was their place, hers and Hubert's, the stillest, sweetest place on all the estuary, and someone had cut a lily there this morning in the dark before the dawn, and rowed it down the half-mile of quiet river to the tea garden landing, and laid it in the little boat in her place and gone. And the lily lay there now in the still gold light, fresh and perfect and impossible, the dew still on it. Georgina stood a long time and waited in her calm way to feel afraid, and she found that she did not. She looked about her at the empty estuary, pale gold and still and hazed with the early light, and there was no one. It was her own landing at her own dawn, and there was no boat on the water, no figure on the bank, no sound but the soft lap of the tide against the piles of the landing, and a single early gull somewhere far out. There was no one. There had been no one all the still soft night but herself and the sleeping town, and yet the lily lay in the boat, fresh cut and dewy, from the far pool that only she and Hubert had ever gone to, laid in her place by hands she had not seen. She bent after a while and lifted it out. It was cool and wet and perfect in her hands, heavy-headed, its broad petals faintly cupped, its scent faint and green and sweet. A real lily, her river's lily, from Hubert's Pool. She held it and turned it in the light, and she was not afraid, not at all. What she felt standing at the end of the landing stage in the still gold morning with the lily in her two hands was something else entirely, something old and deep and aching, sweet, something that made her throat tighten and her eyes sting though she did not weep, something that felt, more than anything else in the world, like a hand held out to her across the water, like being remembered, like someone who knew exactly what Regatta week cost her now, and knew the pool, and knew the boat, and knew her place in it, saying to her gently, without a word, across the still gold water, I know it is hard. Here, I have brought you a lily from our pool. You are not alone this week. I am rowing beside you still. She did not let herself finish the thought, or name it, or shape it into anything she would have to believe or disbelieve. She was not a fanciful woman. She was a sensible one, a woman of urns and tea trays and account books. But she was also a woman who had spent 20 summers on the water, and knew in her bones that the river held more than could be got into an account book. And she was content this first still morning, simply to stand at the end of the landing with the cool lily in her hands, and be remembered and be grateful, and not to pull the sweetness of it apart. She carried the lily up to the veranda, and she did a thing she did not quite understand, even as she did it, but that felt exactly right. She did not throw it back into the river. She filled a shallow bowl with clean water, and she floated the lily in it, and she set it on the little table on the veranda, below Hubert's old straw boater that still hung on its peg, where the light would fall on it through the roses. The first lily of the Regatta, cut and given by no one, floating white and perfect in its bowl. And then she wiped her eyes once with the back of her hand and drew a breath and squared her soft shoulders. And she went back to her tables and her urns and her long, bright, thronging day, with the lily floating on the veranda behind her, and something eased and warmed and quieted in her breast that had been tight and cold in Regatta week for 3 long summers. The town woke. The boats came out. The bunting lifted in the morning breeze, and the first train brought the first day trippers, and the brass band tuned up on the quay, and the great glad noise of Regatta week began. And Georgina Prowse moved among her tables in her fresh white apron and her shady hat, calm and warm and unhurried, pouring her tea and soothing her customers and keeping the loveliest tea garden on the estuary, as she had for 3 summers now, alone. But not this morning quite so alone as she had thought. For every time she passed the veranda, all that long, bright day, her eye went to the white lily floating in its bowl below Hubert's boater. And every time something in her breast grew warm, and she thought, carrying her trays through the glad Regatta crowd, that she did not know how the lily had come to be in the boat, and did not, she found, want to know, and did not want to catch whoever had brought it, and did not want the sweet, strange kindness of it explained away into an ordinary thing. She wanted only to keep the lily and be remembered and get through her Regatta week with a hand held out to her at last across the still gold water. And she thought, though she could not have said why she was so sure, that when she came down to the landing tomorrow in the early light, there would be another. There was a lily in the boat again the next morning, and Georgina was almost, but not quite, expecting it. She had woken before the light, as she always did in Regatta week, and lain a little while listening to the town still asleep and the first birds beginning. And she had thought of the lily and told herself, in her sensible way, that she must not build too much on a single strange morning. A lily in a boat could be any number of things. A gift from a kind neighbour, a trick of some early boatman, her own tired fancy even, though she did not truly believe that. She had told herself all this, lying in the grey dark, and then she had risen and dressed and come down through the dew-grey garden to the landing in the pale first light. And there in the little boat, in the inch of water in the bottom boards, floated a single white water lily, fresh cut and dewy, laid in her place exactly as before. She stood on the landing stage and looked at it a while. Then she bent and lifted it out and held it, cool and perfect, in her 2 hands. It was from the pool. She knew it at once, as she had known yesterday. The particular clean whiteness of it, the deep gold heart, the green sweet scent, the long-cut stem, all of it from the still fresh water of Hubert's pool 1/2 a mile up the quiet river. Someone had gone up there again in the dark before the dawn, to the secret place that only she and Hubert had ever found, and cut a lily, and rowed it down, and laid it in the boat in her place, and gone unseen before she woke. She carried it up to the veranda and floated it in the bowl beside yesterday's, which had not faded at all, but floated still as fresh and white as the hour it was cut. And she looked at the 2 of them a moment, the 2 white lilies below Hubert's boater, And then she set the thought gently aside, as she had learned to set so many things aside, and went to light her urns and begin the day. For it was Regatta week, and there was no time in Regatta week to stand and wonder. The town was already stirring, and Bethany would soon be at the gate, and the long, bright, thronging day was coming, whether Georgina was ready or not. Bethany Quorn came at 8, as she came every morning of the Regatta, brisk and warm and broad, tying her apron as she came up the path, already talking. She was a village woman of 40-odd, strong and quick and endlessly kind, with a great warm laugh and a tongue that ran all day like a mill race. And Georgina, who lived quiet and alone the rest of the year, was always glad of her in Regatta week, glad of the warmth and the noise, and the flow of village talk that ran over the long, hard days and made them lighter. Bethany had helped in the tea garden for years, in Hubert's time and after. She had wept at Hubert's funeral as if he were her own, and she loved Georgina with a fierce, protective, plain-spoken love that showed itself chiefly in scolding. And she brought, too, a great basket of village news each morning, who was ailing, and who was mending, and whose boat had won what heat, and poured it out all day over the tables and the trays. A warm, unbroken river of talk that Georgina did not always listen to, but was always soothed by, the way you are soothed by a stream you live beside. It filled the quiet that Hubert had left. It was one of the reasons Georgina blessed Regatta week, even in the years she dreaded it. It brought the warmth of other people flooding into a life that ran the rest of the year, very quiet and very much alone. "You look tired, Mrs. Prowse," she said now, the first thing, tying her apron. "You do. You're doing too much. And I've said so. A woman your age, running this whole place through Regatta week. It isn't right, and I don't care who hears me say it." She bustled to the urns. "You want more help. You want a girl in the kitchen and another out here, and you know it. Every year I say it, and every year you nod and do nothing, and every year you're worn to a thread by the Saturday." She glanced at Georgina, shrewd under the scolding. "Though I'll say, you look better than tired this morning, somehow. You look, I don't know, eased, like you slept well for once." "I did sleep well," said Georgina, and found it was true, and she thought, but did not say, of the lily floating on the veranda, and of the hand held out to her across the water. The day came on, and filled, and roared. It was the first full day of the Regatta, and the weather was fine, and the whole world came down to the water. The trains brought the day trippers by the 100, and they poured up from the station in their summer best. The men in straw boaters and blazers, the women in white with their parasols, the children shrieking with the joy of the seaside, and the river filled with boats, the racing skiffs and the sailing dinghies, and the punts and the pleasure yachts, and the bunting snapped in the breeze, and the brass band played on the quay, waltzes and marches and the airs of the day, the sound of it drifting warm and gold across the water. And the tea garden filled, table after table, until there was not a wicker chair to be had, and Georgina and Bethany ran from dawn to dusk with their trays, pouring and carrying and clearing and pouring again, and the whole bright, glad machine of Regatta week ran at its full glad roar. It was a good roar, Georgina thought, carrying a tray of floral china through the throng, a happy roar, the happiest sound of the year. The band on the quay, the cheering when a race came in, the plash of oars, the shriek of children, the chink of 100 teaspoons in 100 saucers, the whole warm human gladness of a summer's day by the water. She had missed the gladness of it these 3 summers, even while she dreaded the week. It was good to feel it again, warm around her, and to be, this year, a little inside it, rather than shut away behind her grief. Young Perry Dowell fetched and carried through it all. He was a key boy of 14, barefoot and quick and sharp as a needle, who knew every boat and boatman on the water, and could not be still for a moment. And he ran Georgina's messages, and carried her heavy trays, and fetched her fresh milk from the dairy and ice from the ice house, darting through the crowd like a swift, and was paid in pennies and cake and the freedom of the landing stage, which he loved above all things, for from it I could watch the racing. He was a good boy under the sharpness, quick to see what was wanted and quick to do it, and Georgina was fond of him and fed him well, and let him watch the races from the end of the landing when the garden was quiet enough to spare him. He had noticed the lilies, of course, sharp-eyed as he was. He had seen the bowl fill on the veranda, and once he had asked, quick and curious, where they came from. Mrs. Prowse, them water lilies, there's no lilies grow hereabouts. And Georgina had only smiled and said a friend brought them, which was true enough, and the boy had accepted it with a boy's easying curiosity and run off to the racing. She had been glad he asked no more. She did not want to say aloud, even to Perry, what she half believed and wholly treasured, and could not have borne to have doubted or explained. And through the long, bright day, whenever she passed the veranda, Georgina's eye went to the 2 white lilies floating in their bowl below Hubert's boater, and each time, in the thick of the regatta roar, something in her breast grew quiet and warm. So the days of the regatta went by, and each dawn it happened again. Each morning, Georgina came down through the dew-grey garden in the pale first light, before the town woke, and each morning there was a lily in the boat, one fresh white water lily from the far pool, dewy and perfect, laid in her place in the little unused boat, by hands she never saw, and each morning she lifted it out and carried it up and floated it in the bowl on the veranda with the others, and the bowl filled day by day with white lilies, one for each morning of the regatta, none of them fading, all of them floating as fresh and white as the hour they were cut, a small growing constellation of white below Hubert's old straw boater. She never caught anyone. She thought about it once or twice in the sensible daylight, thought that she had only to come down earlier, or to sit up and watch the landing through the short summer night, to see who it was that brought the lily, and she found that she did not want to. She did not want to catch them. To catch whoever it was would be to end the thing, to fold the sweet, strange kindness up into an ordinary fact, a neighbour, a boatman, an explanation, and she would rather, far rather, have the kindness and the mystery and the hand held out across the water than any explanation in the world. So she did not sit up and did not come down early and did not watch. She only came at her usual hour in the pale first light and found the lily waiting and lifted it out and was grateful and asked no questions. And the strange thing, the thing she noticed as the days went by, was what the lilies were doing to her. For Regatta week, these 3 summers past, had been the week she dreaded, the week most full of Hubert, the week she got through with her back to the water and her heart held tight against the ache of the missing evenings. And this Regatta week was different. This Regatta week, she found, she was not dreading. She woke each morning, not with the old heaviness, but with a small, quiet eagerness, wondering whether the lily would be there, knowing somehow that it would. And she went down to the landing gladly in the first light to find it. And all through the long, hard, thronging day, she carried the warmth of it with her, the knowledge that she was remembered, that a hand was held out to her across the water, that she was not, this week, so alone as she had been. The lilies were carrying her through. That was the truth of it. Morning by morning, the lilies were carrying her gently through the week she had dreaded, the way Hubert's boat had once carried her out onto the still evening water. And she was more grateful for it than she could have said. Old Crispin Membry noticed the change, as watermen notice things. He was the old boatman of the quay, a weathered, leathery man of 60 who had hired out punts and pleasure boats on the estuary for 40 years, and had known Hubert all his life, and rowed in the Regatta with him as a young man, a slow, kind, salt-cured old man, with faded blue eyes that had looked at the water so long they had gone the colour of it. He came up to the tea garden on the 3rd afternoon, as he did most days of the Regatta, to take a cup of tea in the shade and rest his old bones and watch the racing from the wall. And he looked at Georgina, moving among her tables, and he looked at her a while with his faded blue eyes. And when she brought him his tea, he said, in his slow, deep voice, "You're carrying it easier this year, Mrs. Prowse. The week, I mean. Regatta week." He stirred his tea. "I've watched ye these 3 summers. It's been a hard week for ye since Hubert went, though you've never let it show, or not to most, but it's been hard. I could see. And this year, somehow, it's easier on ye. I'm glad of it. Hubert wouldn't have wanted the week to be a grief to ye. He loved it too well for that." Georgina stood with her empty tray and looked at the old man, and was moved almost past speaking. For he had seen, all these summers, what she had thought she hid from everyone. "It is easier this year, Crispin," she said after a moment, quietly. "I don't rightly know why, but it is." "Well," said old Crispin, and looked out at the bright water, at the boats and the bunting and the racing. "The river looks after its own, I've always said. Hubert was the river's own, if ever a man was. And you're Hubert's." He drank his tea. "The river looks after its own." And he said no more, being a man of few words. But Georgina carried the saying with her through the rest of the day. The river looks after its own, and found it a strange, deep comfort, though she could not have said quite why. The river looks after its own. She thought of all the years she and Hubert had spent upon it, the 20 summers, the 10,000 cups of tea poured at its edge, the long still evenings rowing up to the pool. And she thought that perhaps old Crispin was right, that a river you have loved so long and given so much of your life to is not a thing that merely runs past and forgets you, but a thing that knows you and holds you and looks after its own. It was not a sensible thought. She knew that, but it was a comforting one, and she had need of comfort in Regatta week, and she let herself keep it. That evening, when the last customer had gone, and Bethany had gone home and young Perry had run off to the quay, Georgina did a thing she had not done in 3 summers. She did not turn her back on the water and pack away with her eyes down. She stood, instead, at the low wall at the water's edge, in the long gold light of the Regatta evening, and she looked at the little boat tied at the landing, Hubert's boat, the boat she could not untie. And she looked at it for a long time in the gold light, with the day's lily fresh in its bowl behind her. And she did not untie it. Not yet. Not this evening. But she looked at it, and she did not turn away. And that was more than she had managed in 3 long summers. For something was changing in her, gently, morning by morning, lily by lily. And she felt it changing, though she could not have named it. The lilies were doing more than carrying her through the week. They were drawing her, softly, back toward the water, back toward the boat, back toward the still gold evenings she had shut away for 3 summers, because she could not bear them. She did not know where the gentle drawing would lead her. She did not, yet, let herself wonder too hard. But each morning, the lily was in the boat, in her place, from Hubert's pool, laid by hands she never saw. And each evening she found she could look a little longer at the little boat by the landing, without the old ache closing her throat. And she followed the gentle drawing of it, trustingly, day by day, deeper into the sweet, strange heart of her Regatta week. She stood at the wall until the light began to go, that 3rd evening, looking at the boat and the darkening water. And then she turned, at last, and went up through the quiet garden to the veranda, and looked at the day's lilies floating white in their bowl, below Hubert's boater, 3 of them now, 4. And she touched the boater once, gently, on its peg, the old straw boater he had worn every regatta of his life, and she said softly to the empty veranda, to the lilies, to the boater, to the still gold evening, "Thank you." And then she went in, to her quiet cottage, and to her bed, and she slept deeply and sweetly, as she had not slept in a Regatta week for 3 long summers, and did not dream. Or if she dreamed only of white lilies on still gold water, and a boat rowing quietly up the darkening river toward the pool. On the 4th morning of the Regatta, Georgina came down to the landing in the pale first light and found the lily in the boat as she had known she would. And this morning, for the first time, she did not lift it out and carry it up to the veranda. She stood on the landing stage in the still grey-gold light and looked at the lily, floating white and perfect in the inch of water in the bottom of the little boat in her place. And she looked at the little boat itself, Hubert's boat, tied at the landing, gone grey with 3 summers' weather. And she looked at the mooring rope, soft and green with river damp, knotted to the iron ring on the piling. And she found, standing there in the still morning, that she wanted very much to untie it. She did not quite dare. Not yet. It is a strange thing to be afraid of a boat you have loved. Georgina had rowed and been rowed all her life, had grown up on the estuary, had no more fear of the water than she had of her own kitchen. And yet, for 3 summers, this one small boat, this dear familiar boat that Hubert had built with his own hands, had frightened her, or not frightened exactly, but held her off, the way the door of a room where someone has died will hold you off, not from any fear of harm, but from the sheer unbearable fullness of what waits inside. To untie the boat and row out alone was to go into that room. She had not been able to do it, but the lilies, morning by morning, were opening the door for her, gently, an inch at a time. She did not do it that morning, but she wanted to, which was itself a thing she had not felt in 3 summers, and she stood on the landing a long while in the pale light, with the lily floating in the boat and the want rising in her, and she let herself feel it, the wanting without shutting it away. She wanted to step down into the boat and take up the oars and untie the rope and row out as she had not rowed out in 3 summers onto the still gold morning water. Wanted it the way you want a thing you have long forbidden yourself, with a kind of trembling. She did not do it, but she wanted to, and she thought, standing there, that the lilies had brought her to this, morning by morning, had drawn her gently all the way from the woman who packed away with her back to the water, to the woman who stood on the landing at dawn and wanted to untie the boat. And she was almost, that 4th morning, ready. Almost. Not quite. She lifted the lily out at last and carried it up to the veranda and floated it with the others. But she went back down after and stood at the wall and looked at the boat again twice more through the morning before the customers came. The day was quieter than the days before. It was the 4th day of the regatta, a Thursday, the lull in the middle of the week. The great crowds came at the weekend, at the beginning and the end, and the middle days were gentler. The tea garden busy but not thronged, the racing less grand. And in the middle of that quieter 4th afternoon, when Bethany could manage the few tables alone and young Perry was watching the racing from the landing, Georgina found that she had, for the first time in the whole regatta, an hour to herself, and she did a thing she had been moving toward, without quite knowing it, all the week. She walked up the river to the pool. Not by boat, she could not yet take the boat. On foot, along the old towpath that ran up the quiet side of the estuary, away from the town and the bunting and the band, into the green stillness above the tide. It was 1/2 a mile, no more, but it was another world. For the moment you left the regatta behind, the river changed, grew narrow and green and quiet, overhung with alders and willows, the water still and fresh and brown, the only sound the birds and the small plash of a moorhen, and the far, far ghost of the band drifting up from the town. Georgina walked up the towpath in the green afternoon light, under the trees, beside the still water, and felt the regatta fall away behind her, and the old deep quiet of the upper river come down over her like a cool hand. And she came, in a 1/2 mile, to the place where the narrow overhung channel turned off the main river, the channel most people rode straight past that led to the pool. She had forgotten, in 3 summers of not coming, how quickly the river changed above the town. 20 yards past the last cottage and the Bunting was behind you. 50, and the band was only a far sweet ghost on the air. 100, and there was nothing but the green tunnel of the trees, the still brown water, the dip and ring of a moorhen, the dragonflies stitching the light, and the deep old quiet of the upper river that Hubert had loved above all the noise of the regatta. It was the same quiet as ever. The regatta roared and glittered for 1 week a year down at the town, but up here, above the tide, the river kept its own deep summer stillness, unchanged, patient, waiting, exactly as it had kept it all the summers of her life. She could not follow the channel on foot. It ran off through the water meadows, reachable only by boat. But there was a place on the towpath, a gap in the alders, where you could look down the channel and see, at its end, a gleam of the pool beyond. And Georgina went to that place, as she had gone to it once or twice in the 3 summers, when the ache grew too great, and stood in the gap in the alders, and looked down the green channel at the far gleam of Hubert's pool. And she saw the lilies, even from here, even half hidden down the overhung channel, she could see them. The pool beyond, white with water lilies, more of them than she had ever seen. A whole still green pool starred and crowded with white lilies open to the afternoon, floating on their broad, flat leaves. More lilies than the pool had ever held in all the summers she and Hubert had rowed up to it. She stood in the gap in the alders and looked down the channel at the far white crowded pool, and her breath caught. For it was from there, she knew, that the morning lilies came, one each dawn, cut fresh and rowed down. And the pool was fuller of lilies this summer than she had ever known it, as though it were growing them on purpose, as though it had more than enough and to spare, as though it would never run short, however many were cut. One each dawn, all the long week. She had never seen the pool so full. In the old days there had been lilies, yes, a good scatter of them, enough to make it lovely, enough to sit among of an evening. But never this, never the whole green surface crowded and starred and heaped with white, as though every lily that had ever bloomed there had come back at once, as though the pool were pouring out its whole heart's store of beauty in a single summer. It should have seemed strange to her, perhaps even troubling. It did not. It seemed, standing in the green gap in the alders, only generous, only kind, only like the pool itself, saying, in the only language a pool has, take as many as you need. There are more than enough. There will always be more than enough. She stood a long time in the green quiet, looking down the channel at the pool. And she thought of Hubert. She thought of all the still evenings they had rowed up here together, up the quiet river from the roar of the regatta, up the narrow overhung channel that nobody else troubled to find, into the secret green pool with its white lilies, and how they had shipped the oars and let the boat drift among the lilies, and sat, the 2 of them, in the green stillness, in the last of the light, saying nothing, needing to say nothing, watching the lilies close as the dusk came on and the first star come out over the alders. It had been the sweetest place in all their life together, the pool, the still green heart of all their summers, the place they went to be quiet together at the very end of the long, glad regatta days. Nobody knew about the pool. Nobody but the two of them, and now, of the two of them, only her. And the lilies from the pool were coming down to her, one each dawn, this whole hard week, laid in the boat in her place. And the pool itself was fuller of lilies than she had ever seen. And she stood in the gap in the alders and looked at it and did not weep, but was filled instead with a great, still, aching tenderness that was almost more than she could hold. She understood, standing there, more than she had let herself understand before. She did not say the word, even to herself. She was not a fanciful woman, and she did not need to say it. But she understood that the pool was theirs, hers and Hubert's, and that only Hubert had ever known the way to it as well as she, and that the lilies came from there, one each dawn, and that whatever it was that cut them and rode them down and laid them in the boat, in her place, knew the pool and knew the boat and knew her place in it, and knew exactly what Regatta week cost her and loved her, and would not let her carry the week alone. It was the boat that told her, as much as the pool, for the lily was never laid just anywhere in the little boat, but always in one place, always in the stern, in the passenger's place, in her place where she had sat 20 summers, with her hand trailing in the water while Hubert rowed. Whoever laid the lily knew that place, knew it was hers, knew she had sat there, and where, and how. And there was only one person in all the world who had ever rowed her up to the pool and watched her sit so, evening after evening, summer after summer, in the stern of the little boat with her hand in the cool green water. And she found, understanding it, that she was not afraid and not even sad, but only filled with a tenderness so deep and so quiet that it was very close to joy. And she stood in the green gap in the alders, looking down the channel at the white crowded pool, until the light began to lengthen, and she knew she must go back to her tea garden and her tables. And then she turned and walked back down the towpath in the long green gold light, changed, softened, quieted, ready now, or almost ready, for the thing she knew was coming. On the way back down the towpath near the town, where the river began to widen and the first bunting showed through the trees, she met old Crispin Membury sitting on an upturned punt in the green shade, mending a rowlock, his old hands slow and sure at the work. He looked up at her as she came, and he saw, with his water-coloured eyes, where she had been. For the towpath led nowhere but up the quiet river, and a woman did not walk up it, alone, in the middle of Regatta week, for nothing. "Been up the river, Mrs. Prowse," he said, not a question, "up toward the still water." "Yes," said Georgina, "up toward the pool, not to it. I went on foot, but up toward it. I looked down the channel." She paused in the green shade, and then she said, because it was old Crispin, who had known Hubert all his life, and who understood the river, "The pool's full of lilies this year, Crispin, fuller than I ever saw it, white with them." Old Crispin was quiet a while, his slow hands still on the rowlock. Then he said, looking out at the water, "It would be." And he said nothing more for a moment. And then he said, slow and deep, "Hubert loved that pool. He took me up there once, years back, showed me the way, made me swear I'd not tell a soul, his and yours. He said it was. The stillest, sweetest water on all the river, he said. He said, Crispin, when I'm gone, that's where I'll be, if I'm anywhere. Up at the still water, among the lilies, waiting for my Georgina to row up of an evening. He said it laughing, mind, the way he said most things, with that great laugh of his. But he meant it under the laughing, I could tell. A man knows sometimes where his heart's truly moored, and Hubert's was moored up at that pool, with you, in the still green water, and always would be, living or dead. The old man looked at her, kindly, steadily, with his faded blue eyes. He's up at the still water, Mrs. Prowse, among the lilies, where you and he were always happiest, waiting, maybe, for you to find your way back up to him, when you're ready, in your own time. Georgina stood in the green shade and looked at the old man, and her eyes filled, but she did not weep, and what she felt was not grief, but the deep, warm easing of a thing long held tight. Thank you, Crispin, she said softly. Thank you for telling me. Well, said old Crispin, and bent again to his rowlock. The river looks after its own. And he said no more. And Georgina walked on down the towpath into the town, into the bunting and the band and the bright crowd, carrying the old man's words in her breast like a warm coal, up at the still water among the lilies, waiting for you to find your way back up. She did not know whether to believe it in the sensible part of her mind, but she found that afternoon that she did not need to know whether to believe it, that it was enough to hold it gently, the way she held the lilies, and be warmed by it, and let it draw her softly, the last of the way toward the water. That evening, the fourth evening, when the tea garden had emptied and Bethany had gone, and the light was going long and gold across the estuary, Georgina came down to the landing and stood by the little boat and looked at it in the gold light. And she reached out at last and put her hand on the mooring rope. She did not untie it, not that evening. Her hand rested on the soft green rope, and she stood a long while in the gold light, with her hand on the rope and the want rising in her, so close now, so nearly ready. And then she took her hand away, gently, and did not untie it, not yet. But she had put her hand on the rope. For the first time in 3 summers, she had put her hand on the rope. And it had not been dreadful. That was the thing she carried away from it, standing in the gold light. She had touched the rope, the very rope Hubert had knotted, and the sky had not fallen, and the ache had not risen up and closed her throat. There had been only the warm, rough softness of the old rope under her hand, and the gold light on the still water, and a great tender nearness, as though Hubert stood just at her shoulder in the evening light, not gone, not lost, only waiting, quietly, for her to be ready. And she knew, standing there in the last of the gold light, that it would not be long now, that soon, very soon, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after, she would untie the little boat and step down into it and take up the oars and row out at last onto the still gold water and up the quiet river and up the narrow channel to the pool. And she was not afraid of it any more, not afraid at all. She was only, quietly, achingly, ready, almost ready, nearly ready, ready very soon. She went up through the darkening garden to the veranda. and she looked at the lilies floating white in their bowl, below Hubert's boater, 4 of them now, 5. And she touched the old straw boater once, gently, on its peg. And she said softly to the boater, to the lilies, to the still gold evening, and the darkening water, and the quiet river running up to the pool, "Soon, my dear, I'm nearly ready. Wait for me a little longer. I'm coming up to the still water soon." And then she went in, to her quiet cottage, and to her bed, and she slept deeply and sweetly, and dreamed, this time, that she was rowing, alone and yet not alone, up the quiet river in the last gold light, up the narrow overhung channel, into the still green pool, white with lilies, where someone she could not quite see sat waiting for her among the flowers, in the boat, in the stillness, at the sweet green heart of all their summers. The last morning of the regatta came, the morning of the last race, and Georgina came down to the landing in the pale first light and found the little boat empty. There was no Lily. She stood on the landing stage in the still grey gold light and looked at the little boat tied at the landing where it had sat 3 summers, and there was nothing in it. No white lily floating in her place, no fresh bloom from the pool, only the inch of clear water in the bottom boards and the grey worn wood and the shipped oars. For the first morning in all the week, the boat was empty. She felt the small clutch of loss she had half known would come. The sweet daily kindness ended, the hand withdrawn. And then, standing there in the still morning, she understood slowly why the boat was empty, and the understanding was so gentle and so right that the loss turned, even as she felt it, into something else. The boat was empty because it was time. That was the whole of it. There was no Lily this morning because the lilies had done their work. They had carried her morning by morning, all the long dreaded week, from the woman who packed away with her back to the water, to the woman who stood at the landing at dawn, aching, ready, with her hand almost on the rope. They had drawn her all the way back to the water's edge, and now there was no Lily, because there was no more drawing to be done, because the boat was not to be a thing she found a lily in any longer, but a thing she stepped down into herself and untied and rode. The kindness had not been taken away. It had simply, gently finished. The way a hand that has led you all the long way to the door lets go at the threshold because you are there now and can open the door yourself. She stood a long while on the landing in the pale light, looking at the empty boat, and she was not sorry. After all, she was ready. The lilies had made her ready, and now they had stepped back and left her the last step to take herself. And she knew, standing there, that she would take it that evening, when the regatta was over, and the last race rode, and the last customer gone, and the light went long and gold across the water. She would untie the little boat and step down into it, and take up the oars, and row out at last, alone, onto the still evening water, and up the quiet river to the pool. She had known it was coming all the week. Now it was here, and she was ready. She turned and went up through the dew-grey garden to make the day ready, the last and greatest day of the regatta. And she was calm, and she was quiet, and under the calm and the quiet, she was aware all day of the evening coming toward her, the still gold evening and the untied boat and the quiet river, the way you are aware of a great gladness waiting at the end of a long day's work. It was the greatest day of the regatta, the Saturday, the day of the last race and the grand finish. And the whole world came down to the water. The crowds were greater than any day of the week, the trains disgorging them by the hundred, the quay black with people, the river crowded with boats, the bunting at its brightest, the band at its loudest and gladdest. And the tea garden was thronged past all bearing, every table taken twice over. Georgina and Bethany run quite off their feet, young Perry darting and fetching without a moment's rest, the urns steaming, the china flying, the whole bright, glad machine of Regatta Week, roaring at its very fullest for its last great day. And Georgina moved through it all, calm and warm and unhurried in the thick of the roar, pouring her tea and soothing her customers and keeping the loveliest tea garden on the estuary, and carried under all of it the quiet knowledge of the evening coming. Old Crispin came up in the afternoon, as he did every day, to take his tea in the shade and watch the last race from the wall. And he looked at Georgina, moving among her tables, and he saw something in her that made him look twice, and set down his cup and say nothing, only nod slowly to himself, as though a thing he had waited for had come. And Miss Araminta Sackler came, the genteel old regular who had taken her tea at the same corner table every regatta for 30 years, in Hubert's time and before and after, a thin, upright, gentle old lady who had loved Hubert's tea garden all her life and remembered Georgina as a bride. She took her usual table and her usual tea, and she looked out at the bright water and the last race forming up, and she said, when Georgina brought her tea, "How he would have loved this, my dear, your Hubert. The last race, and all this sun, and the whole town out. How he did love the last race." And Georgina said, yes, he did, and found this year that she could say it, and smile, and mean the smile. For she knew this year where Hubert was, up at the still water among the lilies, waiting, and she would be rowing up to him that very evening. The last race was rowed in the late gold afternoon, the great race of the regatta, the crews straining and the crowd roaring along the whole length of the quay, and the band playing them home. And it was won and cheered, and the winning crew cheered through the town, and the prizes given, and slowly, as the light began to lengthen and go golden, the great day began to wind down. The day trippers drifted back toward the station and their trains. The boats came off the water. The band played its last waltz and packed away. The crowds thinned and were gone, and the long, bright, roaring week of the regatta came at last in the long gold light of the Saturday evening to its quiet end, and Georgina's tea garden emptied. The last customers finished their tea and paid and went, Miss Sackler last of all, gathering her gloves, pausing at the gate to say, as she said every year, what a lovely week it had been, and how she looked forward to the next. Bethany washed the last of the china and hung up her apron and went home, scolding fondly to the last, telling Georgina to rest, to sit down, to not do another thing tonight. Young Perry was paid his week's pennies, a good handful, and given the last of the cake, and ran off whooping to spend it. And the tea garden grew quiet and quieter, and at last quite still. And Georgina Prowse stood alone in her tea garden in the long gold light of the last regatta evening, with the whole bright week gathered and finished behind her, and the still gold water before her, and the little boat waiting at the landing. It was time. She did not hurry. She went first to the veranda and looked at the bowl of lilies, the whole week's lilies floating white and unfaded below Hubert's straw boater, one for every morning but this last. And she looked at them a long while, and then she took up the bowl gently in her two hands to carry with her, and she touched the old straw boater once on its peg, and she did not take it. It belonged there, on its peg, on the veranda, as it had belonged there 3 summers. But she touched it gently in farewell, or not in farewell, but in a kind of greeting, as though to say, I am going up to find you now. And then she carried the bowl of lilies down through the quiet golden garden to the landing, and she set it down on the boards, and she stood by the little boat in the last of the gold light, and she reached out, and she untied the mooring rope. It came loose easily, the old knot, Hubert's knot, softened by 3 summers of weather, loosening under her fingers, as though it had only been waiting, all this while, to be untied. And she coiled the rope, and she steadied the little boat against the landing, and she stepped down into it, into Hubert's boat, for the first time in 3 summers, and it took her weight and rocked gently and settled, holding her, the way it had held her 20 summers, and she sat down in the stern, in her place, in the passenger's place where the lilies had lain all the week. And then she moved forward to the thwart and shipped the oars, and took them in her 2 soft, capable hands, and she rowed out. She rowed out onto the still gold evening water, alone for the first time in 3 summers. Out from the landing, out past the low garden wall, out onto the wide shining estuary, going rose and gold in the last of the light. And the little boat went sweetly under her, and her arms remembered the oars, though it had been 3 summers, and the water parted silver at the bow, and she rowed out onto the still gold water and did not weep, but was filled instead with a great, quiet, brimming gladness, as though she had come home at last to a place she had been shut out of for 3 long years. She turned the boat upriver, away from the town, away from the emptying quay, and the furled bunting, and the last of the light on the cottages, up the quiet river, into the green stillness above the tide, where the water went narrow and brown and calm, and the alders leaned over, and the deep old summer quiet came down. She rowed up the quiet river in the last gold light, alone in the little boat, and yet she found not alone at all. For the river was all around her, the river she and Hubert had loved for 20 summers, holding her, carrying her, looking after its own. And she felt Hubert with her in the boat as she had not felt him in 3 years, not as a grief, not as an absence, but as a presence, near and warm and glad, rowing up the quiet river beside her toward the pool. She came to the narrow channel, the overhung green channel that turned off the main river, that everyone rowed straight past, and she turned the little boat into it, up the secret way, under the leaning alders, into the green tunnel of it, the way only she and Hubert had ever known. and she rowed up the still green channel in the gathering dusk, the last gold light broken and scattered through the leaves above her, the water black and still and sweet below. And she came, at the end of the channel, out into the pool. And the pool was white with lilies. She shipped the oars and let the little boat drift, as she and Hubert had always let it drift, out among the lilies into the middle of the still green pool. And it was exactly as she had seen from the towpath, fuller of lilies than she had ever known it. The whole still surface crowded and heaped and starred with white, more white lilies than she had ever seen in one place in all her life, floating open all around the little boat in the last of the light, their gold hearts glowing, their green scent rising sweet all around her. She sat in the little boat in the middle of the pool, among the white lilies, in the green dusk, in the deep old stillness. And she was, in the deepest and quietest and most complete way she had ever known, at peace. She was not alone. She knew that, sitting there among the lilies in the gathering dusk. She could not have told you how she knew it, or who it was she was not alone with, and she did not try. But she sat in the little boat in the pool, where she and Hubert had been happiest, among more white lilies than she had ever seen, in the green stillness at the sweet heart of all their summers. And she was not alone, and it was the most peaceful hour she had known in 3 long years. She sat there a long time as the dusk came down, and the lilies began softly to close, and the first star came out over the alders, exactly as it had come out over the alders all the summers of her life. And she understood, sitting there, that this was the end of the thing and the beginning of it, that the lilies would not come to her landing any more, one each dawn, because she did not need them any more, because she had found her own way back to the water, back to the boat, back to the pool, back to Hubert, and that from now on it would be her own hands on the oars, her own boat rowing up the quiet river of an evening, her own self coming up to the still water, whenever she was ready, whenever the ache of missing him grew too great, to sit among the lilies in the green dusk and be near him and be quiet and be at peace. The kindness had given her back the water, and the water now was hers again, hers and Hubert's, forever. She did not weep, sitting there in the little boat among the closing lilies in the green dusk. Her eyes were wet, but she did not weep, and what filled her was not grief, but the thing on the far side of grief. The thing grief turns into at last, if you carry it gently enough and long enough. A great, still, brimming peace, and a love that had not been rowed away after all, that was here still, on the water, in the boat, among the lilies, at the sweet green heart of all the summers she and Hubert had made. It had not been lost. That was the thing she understood. Sitting among the lilies in the last of the light, nothing had been lost. It had only been waiting, up at the still water, among the lilies, for her to find her way back. She took up the oars, at last, when the dusk had deepened and the first stars were out, and she rowed slowly back down the green channel, and down the quiet river, and out onto the wide, dark estuary, where the lamps were coming out along the quay. And she rowed home to her landing in the soft summer dark, alone in the little boat, and yet not alone, and never, she understood now, quite alone again. and she tied up the boat at the landing, Hubert's boat, her boat, tied it with her own hands to be untied again whenever she wished. And she went up through the dark, quiet garden to her cottage and to her bed, and she slept deeply and sweetly, as she had not slept in a regatta week for 3 long summers, at peace, at rest, at home upon the water at last. And now the regatta is over. The bunting hangs still, the last of the boats are drawn up on the shore, and a little rowing boat lies moored at a quiet landing under the summer stars, home again from the still water. There is nothing left to do tonight. The tea is poured and drunk, the china washed and put away, the long bright week gathered softly in. On the veranda, the white lilies float, unfading in their bowl, below an old straw boater on its peg. And far up the quiet river, above the tide, a secret pool lies white with lilies beneath the rising moon, holding its own sweet stillness through the dark. So let the little boat rock gently at its mooring. Let the lilies close upon the pool. Let the last lamp on the quay burn low, and the tide come softly in, and the whole warm summer night settle over the water like a hand laid gently upon your brow. Whatever you have loved and thought was lost is not so far away as it seems tonight. It is only up at the still water among the lilies, waiting quietly for you. Rest now. You need row nowhere and reach for nothing. Only lie still and let the river carry you gently, gently, out onto the calm gold evening, where someone who loves you is at the oars, and there is nothing at all to fear. Sleep softly, dear one. The water looks after its own. Good night.